got a lot to unpack from last night's game, a look ahead to the road trip. I can't remember a performance of the Winnipeg Jets where there was absolutely no give whatsoever. They continued pushing the pace, and they did it right until that final buzzer. Were clearly the better team and were very deserving of a 4-0 win.
Yeah, we'd seen snippets of that game, early in this season. In some ways, last night reminded me of the season opener against the New York Rangers, with one exception. I mean, in that season opener, the Jets had a really good first period, but they really sagged in the second, and Connor Hellebuck was a huge story. And then in the third, in a very tight game, the Jets were very patient. And as the Rangers got increasingly desperate, the Jets ended up taking advantage of it. And I kind of saw that last night without the sag, if you will, that had kind of become the calling card of the Jets earlier in the year. There wasn't the stinker of a period.
Quite the opposite, to be honest.
Right. They got better. And, in that third period, you could see the Blues, even though they were only down a goal, it's like they could sense that, geez, the Jets aren't giving us anything. We got to start taking some risks here, and credit to the Jets. And, for what Rick Bowness and the staff are preaching to this group, last night will provide a perfect blueprint for that, because the opponent started to take some risks, and there were the Jets playing good defense, which transitioned into good offense. And, Winnipeg managed to pile in a couple more goals and then the empty netter. And at the end of the night, it looks pretty lopsided, right? 4-0 victory. So, that's the kind of game I think that will be easy to sell to the players. It's not an easy game to play, for sure. To do that, 82 times, probably asking too much. But if you could do that more times than not, play that kind of game, you're going to have success. And I think, I know you were talking about it with Sean just before here, the fact that you have the top line, and I know Nikolaj Ehlers is out, not part of that line, but, when you got Mark Scheifele and Kyle Connor that are clearly invested in that style, and we saw a lot of good things from that line, absolute zone domination at times, heavy on the forecheck, and when the puck would go the other way, Mark Scheifele again made a number of really nice plays where he'd be down low helping out. Like, that is the kind of thing that everybody notices. And as Scott Arniel did say after the game, we want all our lines to look the same. Well, last night, despite, a disparity in talent on the lines, I would say they did all look the same, and that's a very good thing for the Winnipeg Jets.
No doubt about it. Mike, I've sort of looked at this first 10-game segment as a period that the Jets needed to sort of survive.
Right.
You don't want to be playing from a big deficit early on in a division like the Jets are in. But when you looked at the schedule and saw some of the teams on the docket, you knew that this was going to be a real challenge to come out in and around 500. I'm sure most people would have taken that. What do you think about the team at 3-3 through 6 games, and the chances of coming out of this next road trip, and I guess that first home game, which is against Montreal, right, at a 500 or better record, and what that would mean for this team over the course of the season?
Well, you're right about the schedule and how tough it was out of the start. Not just playing 6 of the first 9 on the road, but it's who they're playing. Aside from, I guess, Arizona coming up this Friday night, which will be a back-to-back for the Jets, and no doubt the Coyotes are going to be fired up for their home opener. There really isn't a what you would call an easy opponent among them. And, for sure for the first 6 games, that was a real tough ask of Winnipeg. And I think when I looked at the schedule at the beginning of the year, I thought, even if the Jets played well, it's not out of the realm of possibility that they might only win 1 or 2 of those games, just because of who they were playing. So win 3 out of 6, I think, I don't want to say that's the best case scenario. Obviously 6-0 would be best case, but I think the record is representative of the way the team has played, and it certainly grounds for some optimism about what this group can do. Now, we know in the past, these Jets have had a tendency at times to get up for tough opponents and then play down to what should be an easier opponent. They haven't had an easier opponent yet, so we kind of can't judge them on that. But I think we can say that when they're facing, tough opposition, we've seen more good than bad from these Jets through 6 games, that they've raised their level of play at times. And, I had Colorado and the New York Rangers. I predicted preseason that that's the Stanley Cup final next spring. The first 2 Jets wins were against Colorado and the New York Rangers. And the St. Louis Blues rolled into town last night, rested, and the only unbeaten team in the league. And the Jets were clearly the superior outfit for the 60 minutes of action last night. So a lot of good to take away. And you're right. I mean, treading water, kind of surviving this first month, I think is key. We're seeing what's happening, say, out in Vancouver right now. We saw it last year, Huss. Like, a bad start, I don't care what you do the rest of the season. You get off to a bad start, you're done. And the Canucks got off to a horrible start last year. Yeah, they recovered and were one of the best teams in the second half of the year. But you know what? The hole was too big. And to the Jets' credit, they haven't dug themselves a hole at all. They've still got some tough games coming up here in this 3-game road trip. You want to obviously ideally you'd try and win 2 out of those 3 and come back in really good shape. But the Jets, I think, have shown us, some real signs of optimism here. And the fact that they've done it these last few games without a dynamic winger in Nikolaj Ehlers, I think, is even more reason to be high on what these Jets might be able to accomplish.
What are you hearing about Nikolaj Ehlers? When do we expect him to be back in the lineup?
Well, so Rick on the weekend told us that they were thinking that this was a 7 to 10 day total injury. And, it was a week ago today, Huss, that it kind of popped up and he was put on IR. So, extending that would suggest that towards the end of this week, that would be a possibility. Now, one of the I guess potential difficulties here, if you're the Jets, is you have not had a lot of practice time just because of the travel and the way the schedule has played out here. And, the Jets, they're off today. They're scheduled to skate tomorrow. I'll be curious to see if Nikolaj Ehlers, who hasn't skated yet since the injury, potentially comes back in. You'd assume that when he does get back on the ice, it's going to be in a non-contact, at least for a day or 2. And then, of course, the Jets play back-to-back Thursday, Friday. There's not going to be a lot of time to skate there. I'd be surprised if they hold a practice on Saturday, given that they play again Sunday in Vegas. So, I think at this point, it might be almost overly optimistic to think that he could be a player in any of these 3 upcoming road games. I would think, next week back home would be more realistic. And again, it's early in the year. What you don't want to do, and I don't know exactly what the injury is other than that it's lower body. I mean, is it a groin? Is it something else? A knee? Whatever the case, you don't want to mess around and rush a guy back too early, only to then have it kind of come back to bite you and become a more chronic issue. I think at this point, the Jets, would be wise to heed on the side of a kind of caution and patience. Dillon Samberg, by the sounds of it, is closer to getting in and potentially for the road trip. But I'll say this, and I know there's a lot of folks on Twitter that aren't going to like to hear me say this. I thought Logan Stanley had his best game of the season last night.
No doubt about it.
By far. Like, one thing Logan Stanley did last night, Huss, that I really hadn't noticed from him, he was physical. He finally used his body to do the sort of things that you kind of wish he would do more often. He's obviously a huge man, but he doesn't always play huge. Last night, though, there was a snarl to his game, and it was exactly what they needed against a divisional opponent and a team like the Blues who play that big, heavy game. Logan Stanley didn't do anything last night to kind of play himself out of the lineup. So, with Dillon Samberg, even when he's ready, if Logan Stanley is going to play like that, it's going to be really hard to make a lineup change at that point. So, again, that goes under the good problem to have. You'd rather have too many guys kind of playing well and make the decision difficult as opposed to not enough. But yeah, I think with Ehlers, my guess is we're probably looking at back when the team's home next week as more likely when we see him.
Well, and you're exactly right about Stanley. I think DeMello gets a lot of credit too. I mean, he's such a calming influence. I mean, he's an ideal partner for a young player. And much like, the situation I think they put Samberg in against Colorado, toughest matchup you could have. but they did sort of put him in a position to give him the best chance to succeed with DeMello.
Sure.
What have you thought about the other two pairings after the big shakeup midway through this first 6 games of the season?
Well, the Morrissey Pionk one is fascinating to me because that's a pairing that Paul Maurice and even Dave Lowry last year would sometimes go to, but usually only later in a game when the Jets were trailing and they were chasing some offense. But when you think about it, it makes perfect sense to put those guys together with what the Jets are trying to do and what they want their D-men to do. And I think the early returns have been more positive than negative. As long as the forwards are doing an adequate job of covering when one or possibly both of those D-men decide to get up in the rush, then I think it's a perfectly sensible pairing, and one that, when they're on the ice, when Morrissey and Pionk are out there together, it really does make the Jets that 5-man threat that good teams often have in their back pocket. And I think we have seen more often than not the forwards, have covered when Josh Morrissey or Neil Pionk are up there. And look, Josh Morrissey had 2 more assists last night. Neil Pionk's tied for the team scoring lead, I believe, with Josh Morrissey and Cole Perfetti. Huss, who had that on the bingo card 6 games into the year, that your trio of leading scorers on the Jets would be Cole Perfetti, Josh Morrissey, and Neil Pionk? But here we are. And again, that's part of what the Jets are trying to do. And so I've liked it. And, the offshoot of that, again, what you just mentioned about DeMello, I like him as the partner to Stanley because I think it protects Stanley a little bit. It gives him some extra cushion there, if you will. And, by extension, that leaves you with Brendan Dillon and Nate Schmidt. We hadn't seen those guys a whole lot prior to this season, but there's a lot to like about that as well. Again, I thought Brendan Dillon had a really good game last night with that physical element. The Jets were really physical as a whole last night. And, to have Brendan Dillon and Logan Stanley kind of bringing that on the back end, that's a real benefit to the Jets. Yeah, there it is. Lo and behold, Neil Pionk only 1 off the goal scoring lead behind Mark Scheifele. Again, did not have that on the.
Pionk had 3 goals in 77 games last year, and he had 3 goals in like 27 hours last week. It's and you know what? Hey, Bones said the D is coming, and it was a ballsy. I still think about that goal that he scored in Colorado to win it in OT. The stones you have to make that shot, because damn well if it's wide right, it's going back the other way. It could very well end up in your own net. So. Nice marksmanship by the Pionky Tonk man.
We call those in the press box the EK9 because there was a certain former Jet player that was famous for winding up and blasting a slapper that missed the net by 10 feet, ricocheted around the boards, and gave the other team a scoring chance. So you're right. Neil Pionk told us after that game in Denver last week that he was kind of just hoping the shot at least went on net, and boy, did it ever.
A lot of talk about the Scheifele line last night, and of course, Mark had that beautiful goal. Hands all day for 55, but it was a lot of the things that they are not known for. The way they were able to grind down shifts, control the puck in the offensive zone, cycle it. And I know there was some concerns about Kyle Connor and how he had been working with Scheifele on that line and the lack of goals since the empty netter. I got to tell you, Kyle Connor, I thought, was up for the challenge last night of the St. Louis Blues along with that line. Gave himself plenty of opportunities to score. I'm going on record right now. Kyle Connor is getting at least 3 goals on this next road trip, Mike. You can just feel like the dam is about to break for 81.
Absolutely. There's a heater in his future. And I wouldn't have said that necessarily before the game yesterday. I might have, just because he's Kyle Connor. And he's going to get his chances and his goals. But, through 5 games, Huss, there really hadn't been a whole lot of chances. Couple decent ones, but his only goal so far this year is into an empty net. But last night, I know he didn't get rewarded, but he was all over the place in terms of having quality chances. And, right off the opening shift, he pretty much gets a breakaway. Unfortunately, puts it right into the chest of Thomas Greiss. But, he gets that partial breakaway in the second where it looks like Justin Falk slashed his stick, no call. Hits the crossbar in the third period, and he was flying out there. And, if you're the Jets, I suppose the real positive takeaway from last night is you still got nothing from Kyle Connor on the score sheet. You won the game 4-0, but this is a guy who, as you say, looks poised to have his breakout. And we know when Kyle Connor, when he starts to score and he starts to feel it, this is a guy that can come in waves. And so, if I'm the Kings or the Coyotes or the Golden Knights doing my pre-scout, I would look at last night's video and go, the timing isn't so great here. We better watch that 81 because he looks like a guy that's on the cusp. And, I know we don't talk about him too much with Nikolaj Ehlers being out. Credit to Mason Appleton for doing a really nice job stepping in. I don't think we had a real sense of what the Jets, how they were going to manage Ehlers' departure. And there might have been some people surprised that Mason Appleton was the guy. But, Appleton has the speed, maybe not Nikolaj Ehlers' speed, but he's got some wheels, clearly. And he's done a real nice job, again, getting in on the forecheck. And that Scheifele goal last night was a perfect example where Mason Appleton, heavy on the forecheck, good work along the boards. He wins a puck battle, gets it back to Josh Morrissey, who gets it to Mark Scheifele, boom, goal, what, ended up being the game winner. So Mason Appleton has not looked out of place at all. And, there's a perfect example of a guy that plays a bit of a different role when he's with Adam Lowry on the third line, but opportunity has come knocking. And, Mason Appleton has done a really good job of taking advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I know there was a lot of, people with different takes on whether he was the right guy to go in the spot of Nikolaj Ehlers. No one's going to go in and be Nikolaj Ehlers that it's currently on this roster in his absence. But I think he gets the assignment. I mean, go in, forecheck, win a few puck battles, and get the puck to 55 and 81 and let them do their thing. And certainly we saw that last night.